All right. Welcome, everybody watching on YouTube to another Speedrun episode. Currently in the throes of some server problems on chess.com, so fingers crossed that we manage to get some games and we don't get kicked from the server. I've also had some audio problems, so hopefully that all holds up for the next hour or so. Let's start, as is our tradition, with a 10-minute game and go from there. We do get a game against Katsu SBS from Brazil. Good luck. Let's go with a Sicilian. And we face the Smith-Morra. Okay. So we've done so many speedruns and I've played so many openings that as time goes on, I kind of stop remembering what exactly we faced, when we faced it. So I try to err on the side of not repeating things again and again because the speedrun knowledge does build, the videos build off of previous videos. And so that's how we try to acquire a pretty vast knowledge base. We've definitely faced the Smith-Morra at some point, and I don't recommend accepting it to anybody at any level. I just don't think it's worth the copious amount of theory you have to learn in order to not get blown off the board. There is a line that I like to recommend to people, which I think is really underrated. A lot of Smith-Morra players don't know about the existence of this move and get completely confused when it's played on the board. And in order to get a slight advantage, White has to demonstrate encyclopedic knowledge, and even then, practically speaking, I think the resulting position is, it's quite zesty, and if you know the ideas, practically, I think Black does pretty well. That's the move d5. So d5 is surprisingly just not a move that is on most people's radar. It doesn't get a lot of coverage in Mark Esserman's book, Mayhem in the Morra, and the move itself is maybe familiar to you. The less familiar idea is our response to e takes d5, which is probably the move our opponent is going to play. Some people, when they face this move, they get really confused, and they play a bad move like c takes d4, which just gives up a pawn. Our opponent is strong enough. We're, close to 1700 level, so we are going to face the best move. And here, the only move that receives coverage in, I think, Mark Esserman's book is queen takes d5, but that is not the idea that we're trying to go for. We are going for the move knight to f6. Now, if you're a particularly diligent speedrun watcher and you're sort of taking notes and you're formulating your repertoire based on my recommendations, you might kind of see some familiarity and some similarity between this sequence and our recommended response to the Alapin, which is also to play d5, e takes d5, knight f6. So in effect, we're trying to transpose the game into the Alapin. Our opponent plays correctly. Bishop b5 check is the correct move. But now White has to know bishop c4. So our opponent actually does know the best response to this line. And this allows me to demonstrate what I meant when I said that from a practical standpoint, I think the resulting position is fairly easy to play for Black. And even objectively, White's advantage is very small. It's very modest. It's like 0.4 or 0.5 with best play. Here, the best move is b5. This is just book, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time elaborating on the ideas behind these moves. I just want to kind of get a middle game. Otherwise, we're going to lose on time. Bishop b3. Now we need to not forget to play dc. Material, I remind you, is equal because White sacrificed the pawn with the Smith-Morra, and we sacrificed it back right here by playing d5 to open up our pieces. So material is equal. And now we continue with a5, expanding on the queen side and getting ready to push the bishop away from b3. And we get a very, very interesting kind of unusual structure. That's probably the wrong word. It's an unusual position. And it's a position that's likely to be very unfamiliar strategically for a lot of Smith-Morra players. Okay, a4. I actually don't believe this is the best move, but I might be wrong. Now, the idea of the move a4, of course, is to stop the progression of our pawns. And your instinctive reaction might be to push b4, but actually I think b4 is not a good move because it gives White the chance to jump the knight into b5. Why is that scary? Because we don't necessarily want to trade on b5 and give up the bishop pair and give up uncontested control of the light squares. If we let the knight sit on b5, White could follow up with bishop f4, create some early threats of knight c7, and remember, we're still in the center. The best approach here, I think, is just to take on a4 and to keep the b5 square under control. Now, let's understand how we're going to play given the presence of this pawn on d5. So obviously this pawn functions both as a weakness and a strength for white. It's a weakness because it's isolated, and white has to expend a lot of resources to keep it protected. But it's also a strength in the sense that it makes our development a lot more difficult, and it cramps our position, it cramps our central control. And so we're going to have to work around this pawn, which we can do with a couple of savvy developing moves. So we're not going to play knight c6. We're also not likely to play the move e6 because we're not ready for the exchanges yet, and that'll ruin our structure. But what we are going to do is develop the knight to a6. Later on, the knight can jump into b4 or move back to c7. It also keeps its colleague at bay by preventing knight to c5. As for the dark-squared bishop, well, the roadmap should be pretty obvious to you. We're going to fianchetto the bishop on g7, and that is our next priority. We need to get out of the center before white is able to put, let's say, a rook on e1 and massacre us down the e-file. It's an exciting, dynamic position. Lots of open files. There's an open b file, an open c file. Lots of pieces that are sort of suspended in midair. The bishop on b3 is not very well protected. So we're challenging our opponent to solve a couple of unusual, let's say unusual problems. Knight f3, of course, totally natural move. All right, I think there's no reason for us to reject the move g6. And white to play. I'm expecting short castles, bishop g7. Then we're going to castle, and then we're going to start working on surrounding the d5 pawn. But there's a lot of things that could happen. Like white could play d6, try to liquidate this pawn. White could pile up on the e7 pawn. So our follow-up strategy depends entirely on what white does. d6 is played. Okay. So first of all, it's important not to panic because this move looks pretty scary and it's easy to overreact. First of all, remember that your king is still in the center. So bishop takes knight is out of the question. White recaptures with a check. We're not able to get to this pawn. Also, e takes d6 would be harakiri because it would allow queen takes d6, and then our king is just toast. But because the e7 pawn is not actually hanging, I don't think that there is a reason for us to reject the move short castles. We just castle, right in the face of danger. And in the event of a trade on e7, the center opens up, and I don't see any reason that we are worse in that resulting position. Because, well, our dark-squared bishop is really strong. All of our pieces are well protected. White's pieces are a lot flimsier, and so our opponent tries to keep up the tension with bishop f4. Now we have an important question to answer. How should we proceed? Let's try to figure out a robust approach to the position. So what comes to mind? First of all, is there a threat? The answer is yes. White is threatening d takes e7 and bishop to d6, skewering the queen and the rook. So the sort of immediate response to that would be rook e8. But rook e8 I don't like because it softens up the f7 pawn, allowing a move like knight e5 to happen. If we're forced to play e6, this leaves the d6 pawn as a huge asset for white because it's well defended, and we don't want a passed pawn right in our face. We want the ability to be able to trade this pawn on demand. So let's consider e takes d6. If we play e takes d6, white recaptures. We play rook e8. And in that position, there's some really cool variations. But I'm also a little bit skeptical because of knight to g5. So let me think about this. What about bishop g4? Aha. Bishop g4, h3. No, bishop g4, white's going to take and still play bishop. Okay, what about knight e4? Then that walks into bishop d5. Probably not a terrible option. But bishop f4, very, very strong move. Very strong move. Takes, takes, takes. I'm legitimately thinking that right now. I'm not pretending to think. I think we need to play e6. And because of our limited time, I'm going to have to save the calculations and explanations for after the game. I'm going to make a note here. And I'm going to let you in on some of my calculations after the game. Now, I just mentioned that this is not a move that we necessarily want to play, but it also doesn't mean we lose on the spot because our bishop is fully blockading the pawn. We're doing fine. Bishop to e5. And now let's start putting some pressure on white's queen side, rook to b8. Making contact with the bishop. Obviously have to speed up here. I actually think black's position is pretty much fine. Rook to e1. Logical move by our opponent. And now, how do we do this? How do we do this? Let's improve our queen. No, but queen c, queen d4. Ah, then we have rook b4. Okay, queen c8. So basically, I'm identifying pieces that can be improved, and then I'm improving them. But I'm also paying attention to this resource, queen to d4, which is, I think, nicely met with rook to b4. That is why we put a rook on the b file. Otherwise, my idea is to get the queen to b7 and hit the bishop. Notice that the knight on a7 is covering the c7 square, keeping the rook at bay. Bishop to c4. Oh, knight b4 is not a thing. Maybe I should just eliminate this knight on a4. Maybe my opponent should be teaching me. Queen to b4. Bishop a6, bishop a4. Okay, let's try to make things kind of tactical with queen to b4. Not exactly sure what's going on here. I don't have a great feeling about this position, I'll be honest. Obviously, I made a mistake somewhere. b3, okay. I guess I can maybe take here and go knight c5 to d7. Trying to prevent queen d4. Well, I'm trying to take the sting out of queen d4, obviously. Then I'm going to meet that move with knight c to d7, and I'm happy. Bishop to b5. Okay. Yeah, this is not good. Okay, let's try this. Because now, if rook to c4, I think I have rook takes b5. At least staying in the game. At least staying in the game. I need to brush up on my Smith-Morra theory with d5. I feel like I hyped this up, and I just proceed to get completely outplayed out of the opening. Knight to d4, here I will play knight takes e5. So that's not a thing. Bishop c3. Was not expecting this move. Okay, I guess I have to go here. And I suppose he wants to go for the pawn. Showing great positional foresight. Okay. Let's go here. e5, trying to run the pawn up to e4, create some counterplay, doing my best here. But rook c7 is going to be very, very unpleasant. It's going to be nasty. My goal here is just to complicate the game as much as possible. Stir the pot. And I think if we can get him into time pressure, you never know. Okay, e4 maybe. g3. What? Wait, then this does not look like a good move, but this looks like a mistake. What if I go here? Oh, knight d4, queen h3, bishop f1. Wait, but then... Yeah, okay. I didn't see that. So maybe knight d4. What should I do? Yeah, I should probably go queen h3 anyway. And hope for the best. Actually, knight d4. Maybe I can go queen to d5, but then knight c6. What about... Okay, he takes it. Wait. That seems like some panic. Right, that does not look right for sure. Knight takes d7, and now he gives up this bishop. No, that was a blunder. So I think Wait, takes, he has knight c6. So if I take here first, and he takes, I take on a5, hitting the rook on e1. I've got a chance now. And he blunders the rook, as Levy would say. And now it should be made. What a turnaround. Definitely a game that I want to look at carefully because I felt like I was getting blown out of the water. And checkmate. Man, it's like this guy. Maybe his pet cat took over the mouse, or you know. One time, I was playing a blitz game or a blitz match against an IM on my regular account, and we played a game. I won. It was a topsy-turvy game. The second game, he plays like e4, h5, and then hangs all his pieces and resigns. And then the next day he messaged me saying, I'm not kidding. My daughter like took my phone from me and played the next game with you. So maybe something similar happened here. Yeah, obviously I'm not going to, I'm not going to treat my respected viewers as I know you're not dumb. I know you can read my lips here. it's hard for me to make a hard and fast conclusion from this game because a lot of people do know Smith-Morra theory well. But after the opening, it felt like I couldn't quite get a handle on the position. Maybe because I was talking too much. So we'll take a look. Let's keep our minds open. And definitely the finale of the game was rather strange. I'll copy this into ChessBase. Yeah, so if you have ego problems, remember you can always blame all of your losses on a real or non-existent child or pet. So we face the Smith-Morra. And again, just to make sure we have this straight in our minds, against the Alapin, my recommendation is this semi-gambit. It's technically a gambit because white can solidify the extra pawn with c4, but this is not a recommended line because of e6. So in practice, it's not really a gambit because most of the time white plays knight f3 or d4 or the fashionable moves bishop b5 check or queen a4 check. Okay? Now against the Smith-Morra, things are a little bit different. We play d5, and after e takes d5, the most common move for black is queen takes d5. And by the way, this also does not get enough love. I think black can equalize with this line. If you want something that like takes the fun out of the Smith-Morra, you can play queen takes d5, c takes d4, and then e5. And this line has a pretty bad reputation for some reason, but I looked at it carefully with an engine, and I think it's equal. I don't think black is worse here. It's kind of boring, but it's boring for both sides. Now, white's main response here is knight to f3. And after e takes d4, the recommended move is queen takes d4. And most like books and resources on the Smith-Morra claim that white is better here, but he's not. White is not better. And black is a very interesting and very rare move. Queen back to e6 check. So if you want a little insider secret, this move, I think, has not been studied enough, and I think it equalizes. Just a couple of games in the database, by the way. So what makes this move cool? Well, white's probably going to block with his bishop, right? Bishop e3 or bishop e2. If white plays bishop to e2, you're going to develop the knight with tempo, knight to c6. So you're basically like leaving the white queen in the dust. The highest level game to reach this position are two 2400s. Black was Krzysztof Strzelecki, Chess Explained. He knew about this line back in 2016. In that game, white played queen a4, and Krzysztof played queen to g4, which is, by the way, also equalizing. But apart from queen to g4, if you want to keep the queens on the board, I think bishop to c5 is perfectly acceptable. Sorry, not bishop to c5. Not bishop c5, bishop b4 check. Bishop c5 is also fine. But bishop b4 check is sufficient for equality. Bishop to d2. And now queen to g4 is excellent. Queen to g4. If white castles to the king's side, you can play bishop takes d2, and the position is completely equal. Takes, takes, takes. Knight b takes d2, long castle, and if anything, I would probably prefer black. So that's bishop e2. If white plays bishop to e3, which I think is the more topical move after queen e6 check, it doesn't change the nature of the position. You go knight to c6, hitting the queen. White's best attempt to fight for an advantage is bishop to b5, but you cover that move up with bishop to d7. Again, the queen is attacked. White's probably going to move the queen somewhere, let's say queen to d3. And now you can complete your development with tempo. Bishop b4 check, I think, is in equal position. I ran this on Stockfish at a very high depth, and it doesn't take a computer to be able to tell that this position is equal. I mean, it's just a completely wide open center, and the position is largely symmetrical. So I won't delve any deeper into this because we have stuff to get to. But if you want like a pro tip on how to disarm the Smith-Morra without having to learn reams of theory, this queen takes d5 line, I think, is perfectly sufficient for the task. Any questions on this specific subset of theory? Okay, so any questions on queen takes d5? Looks like no. Instead, we played the zestier move, knight f6. And you can check the online database like on Lichess, but I think the most popular move here is c takes d4. And the thing is, after knight takes d5, you get a position that can and usually does arise via the Caro-Kann. So in the Caro-Kann, white has a system known as the Panov attack, and you can actually get this exact position like this. C takes d5, knight takes d5, knight f3. And so the subtlety here is that in the Panov attack, white typically plays knight to f3 right away. Okay, so far, hope you're following what I'm saying. If white delays the move c takes d5, black is essentially confined to playing bishop to g4. Because if black plays bishop to f5, white has this really, really nasty move queen to b3. But let's compare that to this position where white has already played c takes d5. Here, bishop to f5 basically shuts down the line. Because white can still play queen b3, but this move loses. Can anybody tell me why? How does the inclusion of this trade favor black in this position? Sorry that this is so technical, but it's important for you to understand this if you really want a good fundamental grounding in the opening. Knight d to b4. There's a lot of games in the database, by the way. This is not something that a lot of people know. And white literally cannot prevent the fork on c2. If white plays bishop to c4, you can literally play e6. There's no hurry. And there's one really cool line. If white plays bishop to g5, queen to d7. You're still threatening knight to c2. But what if white plays rook to c1, guarding the square? Who can tell me black's winning move in this position? Pretty simple move, but something that you should definitely know. Yeah, knight to a5. Knight to a5, hitting the queen and hitting the bishop. And if white plays bishop b5, after all of the exchanges, it's a beautiful position because either white has to recapture the knight and allow the fork, or white can give the intermediate check on e5, preventing the fork, but allowing the other fork. So it's incredible. White cannot do anything about the threat of knight c2 without allowing some other idea to happen. If white castles out of the fork, then you're going to put a bishop on c2 and win the game like this, forcing the queen to a3. And after knight to d3, the queen is trapped. Literally, the queen is trapped. It has no squares. It's a really, really cool line. And so what it tells us is that white cannot play queen b3. Of course, white has other moves like bishop c4. But after e6, black gets a very, very comfortable position. It's not particularly theoretical. And I think only black is really contending for a slight edge here. So this is one of the many reasons that I like this move, knight f6, right? Some people, of course, they play queen takes d4 here. I don't want to get too bogged down in the theory. But after queen takes d5, once again, only black can be better. We have a nice development advantage in the endgame. And we'll potentially have really nice central control as well. So our opponent demonstrated great knowledge of the best line, bishop to b5 and bishop to c4. Now we proceeded with b5, bishop to b3, and d takes c5. D takes c3. So exchanging the pawns, knight takes c3, and expanding on the queen side with a7, a5. I'm checking with the computer to make sure I can point out where I made the mistake. So white responded with a4, which is a very decent move. B takes a4 is actually correct. So far I played correctly. White's best move is rook takes a4. If he plays this move, you can contact chess.com's fair play team. Our opponent responded knight takes e4. And at this point, black is already like a little bit better with a really, really cool move. I actually was supposed to play e6 in this position. I actually was supposed to play e6 here. And what I missed was that after d takes e6, you have this intermediate check on a4. And here's the other point. White blocks with the bishop. Black plays bishop takes e6. First of all, if white takes the bishop on b4, we can exchange queens. The bishop on b3 will hang, so at the end, black is doing great. And if white takes the bishop on e6, an idea that you have seen before. Where have you seen the following idea? Well, in a different Sicilian. There is the accelerated Grand Prix attack. There is a line where you do something very similar. Let me just try to reproduce it. Actually, wait, no. Which line am I talking about? Trying to remember where I've seen this idea before. Yeah, I can't remember exactly. But anyways, let's get back to that position. Let's get back to that position. Not here. Right here. What is black's best move? Yeah, it's queen to e7. Basically pinning whatever piece or pawn is on the e-file. Obviously, one opening where you see this is the Scotch. in the Scotch, black's main line, one of black's main lines, is knight f6, takes, e5, and now this move, queen e7. Also in the Gleck system, right? This forces white to put a queen on a very awkward square. In the Gleck system, you get something similar, where g3, d5. So in one variation of the Gleck system, where black quickly advances e4, white again has this very powerful idea to play queen e2. So in this case, you have a pawn on the e-file, but our instance of queen e7 works exactly the same way, right? Because you're trying to recapture on e6 without ruining your pawn structure. So your question might be, well, okay, but like, what if white plays queen e2? Well, here white's queen is overextended, and you can play bishop takes d2. Either white has to allow the bishop to be captured with a piece. By the way, rook a6 here is a sexy move, and then capturing with a rook. Or white has to expose the king to a huge attack, and obviously here you're more than happy to take on e6 with a pawn. Okay, so lots of very rich ideas in this system. If you're a tactical player, I highly recommend this. And I recommend that you spend 15-20 minutes just analyzing this on your own, immersing yourself in these ideas. Instead, I played the obvious move, knight a6, just developing my pieces. And unfortunately, after both sides complete their development, the situation isn't great. Black is sort of clearly worse here. And d6 was an excellent move by our opponent. Bishop f4 was an excellent follow-up because it prevents us from playing rook b8. And I actually played the correct move according to the computer, e6. White establishes the bishop in the center. And yeah, our position is pretty unpleasant. So I decided to improve the rook. Then I decided to improve the queen, which, according to the computer, is all very reasonable, actually. But bishop c4 was an extremely powerful move, making contact with the knight. And I'm just looking for my next mistake. Yeah, queen b4 is a very serious mistake. So my actual, like, decisive mistake, or mistake that should have lost the game, was queen to b4. Up to this point, both of us had been playing quite well. The correct approach was to play bishop takes a4, and to do what I wanted to do a little bit later, which is to get the knight around back to d7. Of course, this involves giving away a pawn. Yes, that's true. But at the very least, you're able to get your knights on d7 and f6. Actually, this is the best move according to the computer, queen to b4. Very, very difficult to find. And it turns out that black is doing quite fine because white has a hard time making progress. Not the most instructive sequences, but just kind of giving you a sense of what happened. b3 is the best move. And after takes, knight to c5, our opponent once again found the best move, bishop to b5. I try to get my knight back to the blockading square. And bishop to c3, again the best move. Queen to f4. And I was very impressed. Yeah, bishop takes a5, e5. Rook c7 is, I would argue, obvious move. Yeah, white is now completely winning. I'm trying to complicate the game with e4. g3, not the best move. Not the best move. Queen to f5. And here, after bishop takes d7, white relinquishes his entire advantage with this very strange move. The best move was knight to d4, and white is still completely winning. White is still completely winning. Because if you try to get into h3, the bishop drops back to f1, and the queen has no good squares. Black can resign. So, yeah, definitely a strange kind of climax to the game because our opponent takes on d7. Now the bishop is hanging. And the only way for white to not be worse was to move the knight back to d2 in order to be able to capture on d7. But after bishop c3, black is doing well. Once queen takes a5 happens, white just forgot that the rook was hanging and then blundered mate. Yeah, so definitely, I would argue, not a sexy game, not a pretty game, a clunker. Absolute clunker, but sometimes you have to play these games. Like, sometimes you just get a weird opening, and then you get a slightly bad position, and you just have to kind of hunker down and wait for your opponent to blunder. We have one question. I do want to get one blitz game in. How was rook takes a4 best? So, how was rook takes a4 best? Well, the point is this. If you play bishop takes a4, white plays bishop takes a4 check and gets a massive initiative against the king. So, here's what happens. White plays knight f3. Black has only one good way to develop, which is to play g6, of course. Now, white plays the obvious knight e5. You play bishop g7. white establishes a knight on c6, and then castles to the king side. And the problem for black is that in order to get your king out of the center, you will have to sacrifice the e7 pawn, giving white this like huge passer. And white just gets like a massive initiative with his minor pieces. Knight b5, bishop to e3, d6. And the position remains very double-edged. But yeah, this is like a computer idea. This is not something that I would ever, you know, put an emphasis on as, oh, look at this instructive idea. This is just some computer BS. Any human would play knight takes a4 in this position. Yeah. And my mistake was that I was too quick to reject the move e6. I was just too quick to rule this move out. And once both sides completed their development, I was just under a lot of pressure. Okay, let's play one more 5-minute game. Hopefully it'll be a little bit more instructive, a little bit more fun, and then we'll wrap up. Okay, e4, we're playing Masters Christopher. And we have the black pieces again. Hopefully not another Smith-Morra. Hopefully we get a mainline. Ugh. When are we going to get a mainline knight arf? When is anybody going to play anything theoretical? This is the delayed Alapin. It has almost nothing to do with the regular Alapin. I don't know what to compare it to in real life, like two things that sound the same but are actually completely different. I'm sure the people can supply the proper analogies. The delayed Alapin is a much more positional, closed system. The only thing in common is the presence of the move c3. Now, obviously, don't take on e4 because of queen a4 check. There's a couple of systems here that are considered reputable. The one that was taught to me many years ago is, I think, still the main line bishop to d7. The point, obviously, is to prevent queen a4. Now, our next step is going to be to play dragon style with g6, complete the development of the king side, and we just get sort of a regular Sicilian struggle. Position is about equal. The key thing here is not to worry about the move d4. All right, so a lot of people, they face the move d4, and then they get really passive here. Right, their response to this for black is to start playing like e6 and b6 because you feel like you have already made a mistake in allowing white to control the center with his pawns. That is not, in fact, the case. We start by exchanging on d4, and now we go after this bishop, h6. Our goal, obviously, to get the bishop pair. Bishop e3 already allows us to jump into g4. Our opponent parts ways with the bishop pair, and now the pawn on e3 is a serious weakness. Now there's several ways to play the position, but let's think about this first. Some of you might be tempted to play e5, but let's try to keep the center as open as possible. Let's improve the position of our rook c8. Of course, do not play bishop e6 and walk into the fork. That would be nice. Knight to b3. Our opponent, I think, is starting to lose the threat of the game and allows our queen to park itself on b6. This is a perfect square for the queen because it keeps the d4 pawn at bay, preventing d5, and the queen is totally invulnerable. Why didn't I play this move earlier? Because here it would have been strongly met by knight c4. So I waited for the knight to like move on to b3, which is a really bad move positionally. Now we have many ways to pursue the initiative, but the classic idea is a5, of course. We're trying to kick this knight out of b3 and go after the b2 pawn. Our opponent is doing all of our work for us. He's also giving us this juicy, juicy square on e5. Our bishop drops into e5. Now we have the threat of queen g3. Yeah, white is like tilting off the face of the earth. Let's go queen check. Now let's try to be accurate. Right? This is an important moment for people to pause and see how I continue the initiative. Right? Because a lot of you would automatically play bishop takes h3. Not a good move, as far as I can tell, because of the response queen f3. And as a matter of fact, in the long run, our queen on h2 can get into some problems. The correct way to play here is either to continue our earlier idea with a4, or if you want to win this tactically, I think we can play bishop to g3 check. If you want to play like a Soviet schoolboy, however, there is a move here that I think is a cut above the rest in terms of demonstrating an understanding of how to win these positions. And that's the move bishop to a4, which I know some of you suggested. Is it the top engine move? I really, really don't think so. Is it the top engine move? I don't think so. I don't know. Probably there is some force to win with bishop to g3 check. But what bishop a4 does is it completely paralyzes our opponent. It keeps the queen completely paralyzed on d1. And if white drops the bishop back to c2, at the very, very least, we can play rook takes c2, move the queen back to g3, and pick up the knight on b3. And white simply resigns. The game is over. All right. Let's copy this into chess space. There we go. And so this one, definitely a simpler game than the one we played previously. Our opponent, I think, kind of lost their composure pretty quickly. Okay, so the delayed Alapin is this knight f3 followed by c3 setup. It's very, very popular as an anti-Sicilian, but it has never been considered particularly dangerous for black. So bishop e2 is the main continuation. It is not the only move in this position, but it's the one that we're going to focus on. And I played bishop to d7, which is the recommendation in a lot of old books. Also possible is to play g6. You can investigate this on your own. I think this is Anish Giri's recommendation in his course. But we played bishop to d7. White responds with d3, the most popular move. By the way, if white plays queen to c2, preparing d4, a good idea is for us to follow in kind with queen c7. Of course, the point is to take the sting out of d4 because white cannot take with a pawn unless your name is Alexander Botez. So white will have to take with a knight, leading to like a very bad open Sicilian structure where black has a good development advantage. So queen c2 is nothing special. d3, we decided to take the opportunity and fianchetto the bishop. And so we get this sort of standard delayed Alapin position. I'm still seeing some games in the database, by the way. Even after knight b to d2, this position has occurred before. Akopian versus Sakayev, 2018. 2 GMs. I'm seeing 5 games in the database. Knight to c6. And believe it or not, after d4, white is worse. After d4, white is simply worse. h6. But what would have been our response to bishop to h4? And this is, I think, the most instructive situation in the entire game. How would we have proceeded after bishop to h4, black to play? See if I can find some sample games on this concept. So g5, okay, then white plays bishop g3. You should have a follow-up in mind. What's the follow-up? So give me the entire sequence. Yeah, g5 is correct. What after that? So, just a moment. I'm just looking for some other games on this topic. Yeah, so here we go, for example. Yeah, the point is you play g5. You force bishop to g3. And in this position, there's usually 2 ways to continue. The standard move is knight to h5, the standard move. This opens up an attack on d4, and it prepares to pick up the bishop pair. This is one very typical idea. Where else do you see a sequence like this? Even in the King's Indian, just to take an example. On the black side of the King's Indian, there is a line known as the Smith-Morra variation, where white plays bishop to g5 and then plays e3. And black's main continuation is actually immediately to play g5 followed by knight h5. This is one of black's most reputable continuations. The point is that white almost never has the ability to play knight takes g5 because you have the intermediate knight takes g3 and then h takes g5. Okay? But there is also a second concept here, which in this case is much stronger, and that is just to advance the pawn to g4, winning the d4 pawn. White simply loses the d4 pawn because he has to move the knight, and that's a huge pawn to lose. Very, very common idea that you should be aware of. How would I summarize it? I would say that anytime you have a fianchettoed bishop, you should not be afraid to push the pawn up to g4. You should not be afraid to play the move g5. Most of the time, your bishop will keep the king safe. So the bishop pair or a center pawn is often a worthy price to pay for slightly weakening your king side. Do I have any sort of examples of this from real life? I do. Here's one. Black plays queen to b6, deploying the bishop, and white drops the bishop back to c4. You cannot take on d4 immediately. Maybe you can, but you're giving up e7, and black plays g5 and then g4. The knight has to move, and white's center completely collapses because of queen takes d4. And black wins the game shortly thereafter. Okay? Not the best example, but you can kind of see this in the flesh very, very often. Let's go back to the speedrun. Now, this did not happen. This did not happen because white played bishop e3, allowing us to grab the bishop pair. Here I made an improving move. And very important, when your opponent is repositioning their pieces, you have to understand what squares are now accessible to your pieces. Right? Like, I wanted to put the queen on b6, and probably you did as well, but I didn't want to allow knight c4. So the moment the knight moved, I kind of updated my understanding of the position. Now I can play this move because the queen is invulnerable, and now I can go after the knight. And now I can take the pawn. And now I use both sides of the board. White is completely paralyzed. He's going to lose material. So after bishop a4, our opponent resigned. All right, guys. On that note, we're going to pause. Kind of a working man speedrun today. Not the most interesting games, but, you know, that's part of the improvement process. I'll play a few more Blitz games off stream, but I'm going to head to bed pretty soon. I'll try to stream tomorrow, earlier in the evening. I'll see you guys later. Thanks for hanging out today.